Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy today's video. Enjoy watching.
When my first love confessed his feelings to the new transfer student, everyone thought I'd be devastated. But what they didn't expect was that I was sitting on my roommate's bed, already dealing with a personal issue. Samuel was about to confess to the new girl, and he had asked everyone to keep it a secret. However, some gossip mongers couldn't keep quiet, and they had already told me everything. Everyone knew I had a huge crush on Samuel and dreamed of marrying him one day. This time, Samuel seemed to have genuinely fallen for the new girl. People thought I'd make a scene, cry, and create a big drama. They loved watching that kind of drama between men and women. They expected me to lose control and run out to make a spectacle. But, unfortunately, even after Samuel successfully confessed, I still hadn't appeared. The crowd of onlookers, which had formed almost 3 layers deep, began to lose interest. Samuel's face didn't show much joy. He put his arm around his new girlfriend and pulled out his phone. There were no calls or messages. Samuel frowned slightly, then looked at the crowd and said, "Tonight, I invite everyone, you're all invited." The classmates and onlookers began to cheer. I had been standing behind some trees the whole time and only then emerged. Someone with sharp eyes spotted me and shouted, "It's Luisa! Luisa is here." I knew how this would go. How could Luisa stay out of this? Samuel suddenly looked up, and when he saw me, the corners of his lips curved almost imperceptibly. I ignored the people waiting to see some drama and walked directly up to Samuel. "Luisa," Samuel said, hugging his new girlfriend tighter. He looked at me and said calmly, "You can't force feelings. We've known each other for over 10 years. I don't want to say anything too cruel and ruin our old friendship. From now on, I'll treat you like a sister. If you need anything, you can still count on me." He lowered his voice, "Don't make a scene. Go home." Samuel was interrupted by me, and I took a step forward slowly. He frowned again. "Luisa, behave," I smiled and handed him the bracelet I had just taken off my wrist. "I came to return this to you." When Samuel saw the bracelet, his face darkened suddenly. "Luisa, what game are you playing now? Take the bracelet. Don't bother me anymore after this." Samuel looked at me intently, his voice colder. "I don't care about this little bit of money. If you don't want it, just throw it away." As soon as he finished speaking, I turned around and threw the bracelet into a nearby trash can. "You can throw away all the other things I gave you before too." With that, I left without looking back at him again. When I arrived at the river, it was raining heavily. Standing under the rain with an umbrella, I thought about the dreams I'd been having lately. In the dream, because Samuel confessed his love to Olivia, I cried and made a scene to force him to break up. I jumped into the river that night. But what was the result? I almost lost my life. Samuel only stayed in the hospital for 5 minutes before leaving with determination. The family that had taken me in thought I was embarrassing them with my attempted suicide, and due to Samuel's attitude, they felt I was no longer of use to them. They forced me to leave school and sent me back to my biological parents, who were involved in all sorts of vices. In the end, my life collapsed, and I died miserably in a foreign country. After my death, the person who collected my incomplete remains turned out to be someone I had always feared and kept at a distance, and Samuel, newly married and full of joy, never appeared. These days, the events of my dreams began to become a reality, one by one. If it weren't for these dreams, I would have already frantically called Samuel, threatened to take my life, and jumped into the river. I'm very grateful for this dream. It made me feel like I had been reborn. I can change my tragic destiny step by step. The 3rd time I dialed that number, they finally answered. I pressed the phone tightly and held it gently to my ear. The name Simone Yanez remained on my tongue several times before I finally pronounced it slowly. The heavy rain cut out all the noise in the world, and only Simone's voice, slightly lazy, sounded deeply. "Luisa, Simone is here. It's raining heavily. I'm by the river and can't go back. Can you come pick me up?" The other end of the line was silent for a few seconds. Nervously, I gripped the umbrella handle with my sweaty palm. In the dream, when Simone collected my remains, he seemed to be crying, and his tears fell one by one onto my decomposing flesh and bones. Even in the dream, I could feel that burning sensation. Later, he carried a small bottle of my ashes with him throughout his life and was alone his whole life. I couldn't help but let out a few tears and stifle a sob. "Why are you crying?" Simone's voice suddenly resonated. He still had that indifferent tone, even with a hint of impatience. "I didn't say I wouldn't come." "So, when will you arrive?" "Wait, I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Okay, I'll wait." Simone didn't say anything else, and the call ended. 15 minutes later, I gave my umbrella to a mother and her son seeking shelter from the rain. So, when Simone arrived, I was already soaked from head to toe. When he got out of the car, his thin lips were firmly pressed together, and his face was as cold as if it contained frost and snow. I pushed my wet bangs aside and looked at him with a bright smile. "Simone, you're really punctual." "Louisa, you could die from being stupid." He coldly grabbed my arm and pushed me into the car, then threw me a soft blanket. "Dry off. Don't mess up my car." He looked at me through the rearview mirror and then skillfully turned the car around. Obediently, I wrapped myself in the blanket. Then, I couldn't help but glance at him while he focused on driving. When he doesn't have an expression, he always seems very cold and inaccessible. Many girls at school liked him, but no one dared to confess to him. He was Samuel's roommate and often went to Samuel's dorm room. Every time he went, Simone seemed to really detest me. Even now, although he came to pick me up, his attitude was still cold. A moment ago, when he pushed me into the car, he used extra force, and my wrist still hurt with a red mark. It's hard to believe that he's always secretly liked me. I slowly lowered my eyelids. Everything in the dream had become a reality, but now, thanks to my changes, many things had also changed. Would Simone still like me if he never had? I wasn't causing him trouble with this. Back in the dormitory, Simone suddenly turned his head and looked at me. My heart suddenly skipped a beat, and I blurted out without thinking, "Yes, back to your dormitory." Simone pressed the steering wheel and let out a sarcastic laugh. "Samuel won't be back tonight." "I know." I gripped the edge of the blanket, twisting it. He stopped abruptly by the side of the road. I felt like the seatbelt was tightening against my chest, and for a moment, the silence was so thick that I could barely breathe. Simone slowly turned towards me, and in his eyes, I saw something I had never noticed before, a mix of anger, something like pain, but also a glimmer of concern. "Louisa," he murmured in a low, contained voice, "I don't know what you're getting yourself into, but if this is a game, it's going to cost you." His voice was like a sharp, direct knife, and suddenly, I felt like it was piercing my skin. Something in his tone shook everything I thought I knew about him and about me. He began to tremble. I tried to speak, but the words seemed to have hidden in my throat, trapped in fear and doubt. Simone let out a dry, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You know, I always saw you chasing after Samuel like a shadow, without realizing you were disappearing in the process." I didn't know what to say. He had a point, and that hurt more than I wanted to admit. I felt like the world was shrinking, like all the walls were closing in around me. "You're not her, Louisa," he whispered, each word like a secret. "And I think deep down, you already knew this was going to end badly." I didn't know if it was the rain or the pain that made my face feel like it was burning. I looked down, unable to face those eyes that seemed to want to pierce my defenses, tear down every layer I had built around my heart. "What do you know?" I finally said, my voice sounding more fragile than I had imagined. It was as if something inside me had broken, and I couldn't help but feel exposed, vulnerable. Simone took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "I know you deserve something better, someone who sees beyond what everyone else sees in you." Those words hit me with an unexpected force. He had always been distant, almost cold, but now each of his words enveloped me like he wanted to protect me from pain. I felt the urge to cry, but I swallowed my tears and forced a smile, trying to regain control. "I don't care what I deserve, Simone," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I just want to finish this once and for all." Simone looked at me with a mix of exasperation and something that seemed like resignation, as if he was trying to understand the impossible. He started the car again, and the engine roared, breaking the silence that had grown between us. The rain pounded against the windshield, and the sound seemed hypnotic, almost like it was drawing me into my own dark thoughts. During the drive, we barely spoke, but I felt the weight of his presence, like he knew I was about to do something from which there was no return. His silence gave me strength, as if deep down, he understood my need to take control of my own destiny. We arrived at the building of his dormitory, and when I got out of the car, he stayed looking forward, his jaw clenched like he wanted to say something but was holding back. "Simone," I said in a whisper, breaking the air between us. He didn't respond, but it wasn't necessary. I knew I was about to face what I had been trying to ignore all this time. I entered the building and went up the stairs, feeling the echo of my own footsteps resonating like a drum inside my head. With each step, the anger and determination grew in my chest, and when I reached the door to Samuel's room, I didn't hesitate to push it open with force. The door swung open, and there was Samuel, surprised with his eyes wide open. His new girlfriend was sitting on the bed, looking at her phone, but when she saw me, she slowly lowered the device and looked at me with a confused expression. I felt a fire burning inside me, but surprisingly, my voice came out calm, almost tranquil. "Samuel, can you explain how a sister should react when the brother she trusted treats her like a joke?" I said, my eyes fixed on his. I saw his expression change from confusion to annoyance, and he slowly got up from the bed, walking towards me with that arrogant smile I both hated and loved at the same time. "Louisa, I don't know what you're doing here," he said with that condescending tone he always used when trying to belittle me. But this time, I wasn't the same. This time, the game had changed. I slowly approached him and quickly pulled out my phone, showing him the messages he had sent me in the past, all the "I miss you" s, the "you're important to me" s, and the fake "no one will replace you" s. Samuel's eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a shadow of doubt on his face. "What is this, Louisa?" Samuel muttered, trying to take the phone out of my hands, but I quickly withdrew it. "This, Samuel, is a lesson," I replied with a firm voice, feeling the adrenaline coursing through me. "A lesson for someone who thinks they're untouchable, who thinks they can manipulate others and move on without consequences." I felt his girlfriend watching every move with a mix of curiosity and surprise in her gaze. "All this time, you treated me like I was an accessory in your life, something you could use and discard when I was no longer useful," I continued. "But this time, I'm going to make sure you feel what it's like to be discarded." Samuel's expression changed from fear to fury, his face reddening and his lips pressed into a hard line. "You think this will achieve anything," he spat, his voice full of contempt. "I don't care what you think or feel." But I saw something more in his eyes, insecurity, that small spark of doubt that indicated my plan was working. "It's not about what you think, Samuel," I said calmly. "It's about what everyone else will think when they find out who you really are." I showed him one last message on my phone, a screenshot of all his deceptions and manipulations, ready to be published on social media. Samuel fell silent, his face oscillating between anger and humiliation as he watched the evidence on the screen. The reality of his egoism and manipulation was exposed in a way he had never imagined, and it disarmed him. I turned my back and left his dorm room without looking back, leaving his new girlfriend there with her eyes fixed on him, confused and perhaps starting to see who he really was. Years went by, and although I never sought out Samuel, I always heard rumors. I knew he was stuck in his career, that every opportunity he touched crumbled without explanation. The curious thing was that I couldn't feel sorry for him. Every obstacle he encountered was just a small part of what he had sown himself. Meanwhile, I had built a network of contacts, and my company grew. One day, I found out that fate would give me the opportunity one had always waited for. The news arrived one afternoon when my assistant came in with a curious smile and handed me the file of a candidate for a high-level position in the company. When I opened the document and saw Samuel's name, I couldn't help but laugh silently. It seemed like a perfect irony of fate. After all these years of dodging obstacles without knowing that in the end, I would be standing in front of him in the company I had built myself. With calmness, I decided to approve his interview. The idea of seeing him enter that room without knowing who he would meet was a satisfaction I had waited a long time for. The day of the interview arrived, and I was prepared. I wore a dark, impeccable suit, and every detail of the room was perfectly arranged. When Samuel entered, his face paled as he saw me sitting at the front with that same smile he had tried to erase years ago. He looked at me without words, as if he was seeing a ghost from the past who had come back to settle scores. I let him sit down, watching as the confident man I remembered now seemed small, fragile, almost lost. "Samuel," I said, breaking the silence. "It seems life comes full circle." My words made him shudder, and I saw him trying to regain his composure. "Helen, Louisa," he stuttered, trying to find some excuse, some way out. But there was no escape. "All this time, every door you closed, every opportunity you lost, has led you to this moment," I continued. "I've heard you've had difficulties in your career. I suppose it must be frustrating to feel like you're advancing only to find yourself in the same place again and again." Samuel looked down, and for a moment, I saw a vulnerability in him that I had never known before. He was no longer the arrogant man of our youth. He was someone who had been defeated time and time again by circumstances he may never have fully understood. "I know I was unfair to you, Louisa," he said finally, his voice weak. If I could go back, I would do things differently." I looked at him fixedly, letting each of his words sink into the silence of the room. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and looked him straight in the eye. "Second chances aren't something that are given, Samuel. They're earned," I said. "I spent a lot of time in the shadow of your decisions, suffering the consequences of your games and manipulations." I paused, letting him feel the weight of each word. "But here we are today. I have the power to decide your future in this company, and although you've given me plenty of reasons to deny you any opportunity, I want to give you one last lesson." His face reflected a mix of hope and fear. "I'm going to hire you, Samuel," I continued with a coldness that even surprised me. "You'll work for me, and don't make any mistake, I'll be watching you. You won't have anyone to help you or bail you out. Every step you take will be under my supervision." I paused, looking at him fixedly. "This time, there's no one to save you, Samuel." He nodded slowly, without saying a word, as he processed each of my conditions. His gaze drifted away, unable to meet mine, but on his face, I saw a mix of resignation and acceptance. "Thank you, Louisa," he murmured with a broken voice, as if he finally understood the consequences of his actions. I made a gesture with my hand for him to leave, and as I watched him walk out of the room, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. I had waited so long for this moment, and now that it had arrived, the satisfaction was cold, calm, like a flame that burned without haste. As I watched him walk towards the door, a part of me, one that I wasn't willing to acknowledge out loud, wondered if there was anything left of what I once felt for him. Maybe I would never get a clear answer, maybe he wouldn't either, but it didn't matter. From now on, I was the one in control, and he was in the place he deserved. And if someday I saw a glimmer of change in his character, then and only then could I consider seeing him in a different light. But for now, he would work under my conditions, remembering at every step that the power he once had over me no longer existed.